CPSC 219. Basically, these are the administrative set of lecture notes. Tells you what the course is going to be about, including things like grading, how things will be organized. You should know it at this point, but information for why. The lecture is described as asynchronous, meaning that it is not real time. Materials will be provided in the form of some course notes in these videos to allow you to learn the concepts, or in this case, to hear the administrative information described to you. This was determined by the course coordinator, similar to 217. This course has a coordinator, um, and in this case, it's Professor Jonathan Hudson, and he determined this ahead of time. Presumably, he had a good reason for making it non-real time, asynchronous rather than real time. But it was his decision well before being the course, and that's the way the course will be delivered. There are some advantages and disadvantages, but I'm making you aware of it straight up ahead of time. The tutorials for all the sections, however, are similar tutorials you saw previously. They're live and in person in the respective computer lab. Contact information for me. Best way to get a hold of me is email. However, in the email, you should have been told this before, but in case you weren't, you should include the course name and number in the subject line. Otherwise, I might miss it. I tend to focus on these ones first. As well, it might be a good idea to add after the course name and number a description of what your email is about. In this course, there will be a Discord site, and it's actually probably one that will be well used. I won't be using it. It will be used by others who will be answering the questions. And historically, Hudson says that most of the course instructors aren't active there because a lot of the questions aren't associated with the lecture themselves. I will say a very positive thing about it is that Professor Hudson is actually very active because I taught a coordinated course of them last winter. That was 233, roughly the major's equivalent of 219. And he's not only active, he answered questions fairly quickly, not in real time because he's also a prof. He has other things that courses he's teaching, but for things like the technical questions, especially, but not limited technical questions, you will find him a valuable resource because he's the one who made the decision in terms of technical requirements for this class. And unlike your previous class, the technical requirements will be far more stringent. You'll probably encounter more problems, but as far as I could tell, for 233, we use the same tools for 233 versus 219. There are no complaints about eventually being able to have Hudson square away their problems, and he is definitely a very good source to rely on in the Discord. And these are just listings of some of the tools, and I'll briefly describe them in this section. Now back to me. The office time that I have two different types. One is real time. One is in person, and that will be after my other class I'm teaching, a data science class, similar to my 217 class. I make those specific I make myself available whether or not there's specific hours or not. In this case, I make them specific office hours, so I have some real time. It's right after class, either in the class or outside the class. But I won't hang around the hallway if no one's asking questions. That's similar to 217 as well too. I might stay around, depending on my own schedule, I might stay around a little bit longer as well too. The thing is, you're welcome to come here, even though it's after my 211 class. But just like with the email, make sure you identify yourself as you're coming from this class so I can switch gears. Often, but not always, I can tell which class you're registered in by your question, but sometimes it's hard to tell. So it's a good idea to indicate which class you're registered in. I also have, for the convenience, um, virtual as well, so you don't have to be on campus. In this case, I also mentioned is this one. I've never actually had a class in. I think that's biosciences, and I actually have to use the campus room finder because one of my data people were actually asking me about it. Where is it? How do I find it? And I said I have to use the room finder as well too. So look under UCalgary site, type in room finder. This one is it, and if it's biosciences, it's kind of a a kind of out of the way part of the campus, at least for non-bio students. This one, you have the convenience of even potentially being at home, of course. So I have some fixed time that's virtual as well too. Sometimes people want in person, sometimes people like convenience of virtual. So I have both. Oh, I mentioned it's a different link than what I had from 217. That one's expired with the same passcode. So this is going to be very similar, giving you some foreshadowing of this with the contact information. This course is coordinated, and he's the administrator for the class. Uh, Professor Hudson is actually he actually has, I would say, more explicitly, he actually takes on more duties than some other coordinators. So things to ask about, things like this, if you need extensions. As far as I know, he actually is using that faculty of science link, but he hasn't mentioned anything about it, but we'll let you know. Otherwise, he's the one to talk to if extensions and whatnot. Um, Extension requests, this is his requirement. The grading components, he has various grading components. You have questions about them. He's the one to ask because he made them up with some exception. There are two components that I'm responsible for as a course instructor. You will have group work in this class, so it gives you some realistic real world experience. The magic of partner groups, if you have questions, some issues, you can talk to Professor Hudson, or similar to 217, he has a head or administrative TA that should be able to help out as well too. So if you have questions, some similar questions that you had in 217, but also the administrative stuff, and he fairly clearly, even in greater detail than 217, outlines who to talk to for what. And this part's is an expanded role on what you typically see. So he takes on a lot in terms of the Q&A. This part is very similar to 217, where I'm I'm the one to talk to if you have questions about lecture material, for instance. Um, the two graded components, foreshadowing of that I'm responsible for, part of what we call the participation marks, and then that's actually tied into what Hudson calls the bonus quiz. So I have some participation marks that's part of the quiz marks. Name's a little funny, so I put the slash in here. Don't feel bad if you get confused. I was actually confused with 233 last semester, but this is part of this, and more on this later. And if you have questions about tutorial, the content, grading and whatnot, the TA is the one to talk to. That's probably very similar to what you're told with 217. The course resources, this is going to be similar if you had a lecture with me. With the D2L site, you should, well, it's not real time. I haven't taught a non-real time one since the pandemic. My choice is actually to do remote and real time, and then I actually record post lecture, so you have the benefit both of real time remote teaching and then non-real time. But again, I assume that Hudson has a reason for making it non-real time. In case you wonder why I have references to things, make it sound like it's real time. Now, you can get let me think for a second. In terms of my teaching material through my course site, and if you don't like detail, you can directly go to it, and it has numerous shortcut links as well to different parts. The only thing that you can't get from the course website are things like this, the teaching videos. I don't want to have quite publicly linked. You'll see the links inside of D2L under my lecture section. Now, Hudson for 233, um, basically all we had was recommended textbooks if you want a textbook to help you out. This is the one that he picked here, so I don't know too many details about it, but usually people don't spend a lot of time buying a textbook. That's probably why I didn't hear much about it. But he also has apparently some, I actually never looked at myself, so I can't answer questions, some recommended readings so you can follow along in a textbook to kind of match up the schedule if you want to do some reading, background reading. If you can't find where it is, well, Hudson's one to contact. Alternatively, as a U of C student, through the library site, you can actually access some fairly good licensed online textbooks as well too. It's part of your tuition essentially. So you can look, for instance, Java or object-oriented programming. I cannot speak to which ones would be especially good for this course, so you have to do the evaluation yourself. And this applies not just for this class, but other classes, math, biochem, or something like that. If you want alternate textbooks, you do need a textbook. Now, this part, the synopsis here is you should know it because you've at least taken one hands-on course, 217 or the equivalent. Basically, so I'll go through it more quickly. The bottom line is it boils down to with a hands-on course, you learn by doing. People can teach you the principles of something, um, like self-defense, for instance, but you really actually get better at it when you go through the exercises yourself, more active learning. And that's what's referring to. The more active or more engaged you are, that plus means as this one increases, the plus means this one increases. So the bottom line here, so I'm adapting this a bit in terms of a non-real-time class, is that you should at least get the lecture notes and you should go through these lecture videos. But I'm hesitant at times having posted lecture videos. One reason I mentioned for my people at 217 was I have found even in a third year class, 400 level class, that there's pluses on where you can learn at your own pace, re-review things. But if you use it properly, it's a good plus. The minuses, especially if you have open book exams, but not just limited to it, is that just like with web searches, you think with web searches, you don't actually have to learn the material because you can look it up anytime, and that's not going to work. So what you should do with these resources is not only use them as a resource when you need to look something up, but you should also take down notes. Think about what I'm saying. Take down notes, reword things in a way that makes sense for you. And this is an advantage over non-real time because you can stop, pause it, re-review it as many times as you want. And this will help your engagement because you're digesting it. Now, you don't have the ability to ask questions. This is the difference between taking notes properly and asking questions. This is the learning bar becomes an increased. This is the disadvantage of non-real time. That's why I actually pick real time when I have remote lectures. But you can still ask questions after the fact, and that's why I have two methods of you asking questions. So this is my guideline for how to do well. And you should know at this point that what I've said so far basically applies to any class, taking down, attending class or looking through the notes, and then taking down good notes, rewording it in a way that makes sense to you that you can understand later. So you pre-digested it. But with a hands-on class specifically, the learning is with something that's hands-on, you don't get into good shape, as you should know, by just sitting in a class. You have to do it yourself. So the hands-on part is writing computer programs. You get better at it, and then tracing computer programs, especially with the debugging. The resources. So this part I'll go through a little bit more quickly because your experience in not as just as students, but as computer science students, they're an outline. And I do have almost always complete examples available. And I say exception might be if I'm actually sticking very closely to Hudson's notes. I have based my notes on what Professor Hudson has because his graded component, the quizzes, kind of exam-like, but it's through D2L, and it's you can use a note, so it's not closed book. But I base my notes on his notes because his quizzes are based on his notes. So I try and carefully look through what he has. I'll rephrase things and put it my own approach as well too in a way that makes sense. And I have examples I think will be compelling. However, that's why I say unless I actually stick to his notes. And in 233, that's the first time I taught a course with Hudson. I I only stuck to his notes verbatim in one section. I forgot why. So I reworded it a lot. But with my notes, they're just an outline. My examples won't be sufficient. You need to take down notes. You can't just rely on the outline notes. And even though the quizzes are basically the exam-ish component of this class, your open book, don't rely on being able to look things up during the quiz. You have to learn the material as well. Tutorials. Okay. So this part you already know. This part you probably know, but the default for science classes, especially computer sciences, the first tutorial doesn't start as a rule of thumb until after the first lecture, and most of them don't start until the second week of regular classes, not block week. So the regular week of classes will be the week after. Right now, this is for the week after. Check my calendar. It's the first regular week of classes is January 11th to 17th. That's the first week of classes. So the tutorials start the week of January 18th. However, something from Hudson here. So as I said, I was careful to include things that are important, not just for quizzes, but also in terms of other things that you really have to know. There will be demos that occur in tutorials where you're demoing your project. They're not optional, and if you skip it for the week during the scheduled times, you receive a 0. And you can coordinate with Hudson as I think you pick a demo, but you can ask him about the specifics because I'm not attending those ones. So you'll get a 0 for 10%, 10% of your term grade, I believe. That's part of your project grade. The CT, I'd pushed Hudson to have a CT uh, because I never taught with him previously, and I see there's great need for CT. I don't. We never actually talked about CT for this class this semester. I saw that a lot of questions in 233 were funneled through his Discord. So I don't know if there will be a CT. If there's a CT, essentially, it's a Q&A session that's staffed by TAs. If he doesn't have formal CT hours, then what he'll likely do is have the TAs answer questions through Discord. So you have to check with Hudson and TAs to see what they have in terms of the Q&A. And potentially, if you're asking questions through a public Discord, of course, other people could be answering, including other students. If they have a formal one, whether it's remote or in person, a CT, then you can go to the CT, the Q&A session, the NETA. That's an advantage because if it's one that's not through Discord and it's real time, the advantage is you could go to any TAs typically, as long as you're not asking about what a specific person taught. So you have a lot of additional hours. But besides, again, a reminder, so I'm not pushing off into CT, there are other sources of help. Lecture material, you can ask me for help. Email is the asynchronous method, one of the better ways. Now it depends on the type of question. If it's a question, it can be answered fairly quickly. Usually the rule of thumb is email is the way to go. Because for you to type in a long explanation of what your question is, for me to type in a long answer, sometimes verbally it can be done more quickly. So an example of a quick one is if say you forget which week, I don't know, maybe the mode of teaching for lecture, for instance, that's one I can quickly answer. I also have office time as well too, and those ones tend to be, as a rule of thumb, ones where more explanation from you and me are required. And then um, if files need to be exchanged, then you can still email me potentially during that time. If you have questions, say maybe if it's my example, I can look it up, but say it's a code example. Although a proviso is most of the questions weren't so much, actually very few of the questions in 233 were straight out debugging type questions. Here's a Java program, I have a bug. Most of the technical problems there were quite a few technical problems. But again, don't be afraid where Hudson was a good resource answering them. They were more issues with the tool just building your Java programs, a tool rather than Java, and that's IntelliJ, as well as integrating that tool with some of the other things. You might have saw the Java effects, Git and Discord, Git and JUnit, for instance. That's where the problems came in. And that's where you should be posting on the next thing, the Discord server, and then say that Hudson was a really good resource for that. I didn't hear any complaints, except ones that I thought weren't necessarily the most reasonable. They kind of expect it to be real time, almost like an Amazon chat. But again, unlike with chat, it's not someone who's specifically in a help desk answering rudimentary questions and just paid to do that. Hudson's a prof, so he has other things. So it won't be real time, but he says he tries to answer within one business day. And of course, a reminder, if they're assignment grading, tutorial stuff, ask your TA. Now, this part is more for remote learning real time. This is just a protocol because the first time I taught in pandemic, people, they went kind of nuts. They they were just jumping in, sometimes interrupting me right in the middle of the sentence. That's why I have it. The in-person ones don't apply either because it's non-real time. But I have these notes just because I don't necessarily know the mode of teaching when I'm coordinating. Now, if this part, the recordings it captures, well, in this case, I've already made a recording of my teaching as well too, so there's really no need for it. But the rule of thumb is don't capture my capture for various reasons, but not the least of which is if you rely on captures, whether I make it or whether you make it, if you're just if you're not actually engaging and taking down additional notes, and this applies to most, but not all people, almost everybody, this is what my colleagues in education say, taking down proper notes, then you're not going to get as much out of it as you otherwise could. In person is real time. Okay. Programming language for assignments. Okay. We had some debate about this. This course, if you look at the official description in PeopleSoft, that's an excerpt from the calendar. It says object-oriented programming, whereas 217 was about procedural programming concepts, things like branches, loops, functional decomposition. Now, this course still includes object-oriented programming, but less than it has in some other versions. That's where we had some of the debate. Now, you will get at least half of the course on object-oriented programming, but it's less than it has been done in the past, partly by necessity, because he's also having you learn and apply other concepts like testing, extensive testing, and posting on to Git. But also, it's because of how he decided to teach this course, and more on that later. The development tool, I foreshadowed this. JetBrains, who produced PyCharm, is the organization who actually developed the tool that you'll be using, the IDE, IntelliJ. Now, IntelliJ is extremely powerful and it has a lot of features. In fact, it probably provides many more features than PyCharm. I haven't used all the features, so I'll say straight out. But with more features, there's more that go wrong. And with IntelliJ, I compared versus PyCharm, there's more that go wrong with it. With IntelliJ, sometimes there's a repository configuration file that is for your software project. Sometimes that thing goes corrupt, and the solution is re-importing your code and then having IntelliJ rebuild your repository. That's the only solution I could find. You could ask Hudson to see if he has something better. Ask him on Discord. Now, this is the officially supported tool, but if you don't use it, then there's potentially a lot more consequences than with 217. With 217, you could have used something else. I personally used a different tool, IDLE, and there was really not a big issue. I mean, I showed PyCharm beginning just to give you a feel for it, but for various reasons, I used a different one, not the least of which was speed. Now, if you don't use the supported one, there'll be additional problems. You're on your own, but those on your own problems are far bigger than the on your own problems in 217, potentially, because Hudson will tie IntelliJ with additional tools, Scene Builder, and last semester it was version 2. We haven't talked about this semester, so I don't know if he's going to use a different version. We'll talk about that later. That comes in third one. This is for building graphical programs with rather than text-based. You can have things like buttons and other graphical controls, but it's going to be integrated, the teaching, with IntelliJ. Other tools now some of the details. JUnit testing. You had to do some testing in 217, but it's much more extensive for this class. And that's preparing you, because you're more experienced, you're better able to cope with it, but it's also preparing you for more realistic programming and potentially other classes if you choose to continue on computer science. More on this later, but this is a sneak peek from Hudson that describes how you actually will use the testing using this testing tool called JUnit. And from what I found in experience, at least from 233, a lot of the where things will go wrong, the integration was with IntelliJ and JUnit. But again, don't panic necessarily. I saw students who came with the questions. I'd answer if I could, but honestly, I haven't used the IntelliJ a lot, and I haven't used the JUnit a lot integrating the two. Hudson would be your best resource. So I probably wouldn't be able to answer. It's not that I don't want to help, but Hudson is there and he's been a good resource. So many kudos for him. The Git, you've probably heard of Git, and there's more specific requirements that and you might have used Git yourself. The basic idea of Git is it's an online software, a place to store your software. They call it a repository. Just uploading stuff into Git is actually pretty easy. Regardless of the tool, if you don't use IntelliJ, you store the files in files that end in suffix.java, and uploading those files into Git is actually really easy in of itself. However, what you're supposed to do, if I recall, is you're supposed to upload that entire configuration, they call it a project, into Git, and that's the trickier part now. So you not upload that configuration because IntelliJ requires it. And the second smaller thing, potentially, is that you can't just use any Git server, but you actually have to use the uCalgary one. Again, more later, but these are some of the reasons why there's less object-oriented programming than there has been a few years ago, because there has to be time allocated for these tools. But he's allocated time for some other things we'll talk about as well too. Now, the submission of your code, he'll talk about it for each assignment, and then there's a project we'll talk about at least a little bit. You need to submit your code through D2L unless otherwise told. Sometimes you actually have to submit, I think the later ones through Git, but the earlier ones are all through the regular D2L Dropbox. Now, getting Java set up. This isn't just a case where you're getting Java set up, but getting Java IntelliJ set up. And that's trickier than what it seems. What I haven't done yet, but I will, is 233. I got IntelliJ set up, and it's extremely finicky. I'll say that. There's more things that can go wrong. If you don't do things in the proper order, you're cooped and you have to restart. At the beginning of 233, I took note of these things, and I'll post them sometime, basically my set of notes, things to be very careful about. But it's not a step-by-step guide. I didn't make one. I didn't bother make one because Hudson already has one somewhere inside of D2L. He has a lot of links to YouTube videos. So if you have questions about it, first off, where to find it. If you can't find it in detail, then he's the one to ask. If you have questions about the steps or whatnot, again, he's the one to ask. I found, at least my feel from the students in 233 is that, yes, they had a lot of problems with these things, but also his videos and were pretty good for helping them through these. And then the Discord server was an additional helpful resource. The API. Can't recall if you actually learned that term, exposed that term in 217. In my lecture, I may not have referred to it because the API in Python isn't nearly as good as it is in Java. I don't know if the other lectures did or not either in 217. But the API is extremely useful if you use it properly. What it is not to be used as is a tutorial. That's what I'm referring to here. But it's used essentially as a reference. Once you know the basics, so tutorials, you're learning the basics. The API is not for learning the basics, but it tells you how to use something. So you should know this term, at least a little bit, methods and attributes, how to use the code in the predefined classes in Java. And here it's actually a lot more extensive than Python. The metaphor is the API is like the car's owner manual. It tells you the features of the car and how to access the features, but what it won't is it's not a tutorial for learning how to drive. Here's an example. Here's the overall API, and they keep going through different versions. This one, if you look at it at first, you think, well, this isn't overly useful because Java is actually very big. They don't actually drill in details, but when you actually look at the specific ones, say for the scanner class, the scanner class is used to get text input from the user. It's a new class. When you look up a specific class, that's where it's extremely useful. So when you look up this one, there you'll see very specific details. But when you first look at it, it's going to look intimidating. Learning how to get text input will be challenging if you're just using the API, but we'll have some stuff on that lecture later. Now, so I put the brackets Jonathan Hudson. This comes from his notes, either paraphrased or quotes. When basically trying to discuss concepts of other students, that's what he's saying, or these other people, keep in mind that the assignments are individual work. There's assignments and there are projects. Unlike 217, they're two separate things. Most instructors delineate this way. These are smaller ones, these are bigger ones. That's why I kind of tripped over at 217 because interchanging them, calling assignments projects was a little unusual. The assignments for 233, they were individual. The projects are group work. You'll get more details on this. Um, they were pair students at 233, if I recall. He was actually saying there'll be larger groups in 219, but you'll get more details later. You can discuss your project, obviously, with your group members, but you can't discuss your assignments of your group members because this is supposed to be individual. Assignments are individual, projects are group. And what you cannot do is discuss your project with other people outside your project. I should also tack on, I did mention this to Hudson, gave a heads up to him, and he actually apparently had a meeting with this coordinator, with the coordinator 217. But in case he doesn't stress this, unlike 217, this is why I gave Hudson a heads up. Most classes don't allow students to actually use AI, let alone like 217, where it was an integral part or you're strongly encouraged to use it. In this case, don't use AI to produce what you're submitting. That's the bottom line. Hudson should provide something more specific because I gave him that heads up that I told him you need to actually stress this because students are expected to use it. And I'm putting this right here. You cannot use it for this way. You can still use it for learning, for instance, or produce code that you're not submitting. And there it is encouraged, but don't over rely on it because you need to learn the concepts yourself. But this is the part I don't want people getting in trouble for. And that's why I mentioned to Hudson. I'm stressing it in my lecture, but Hudson should be stressing it somewhere for all lectures because I don't teach all the lectures in this class. So I'm doing this to protect you essentially because I don't want you getting in trouble. So what this class is about now, this comes from Hudson, paraphrasing. This is another reason why we don't, in this class, go through as much object orientation as some other semesters. He actually goes through in about the first half of the course, stressing not only the difference between Python and Java, but also um, the with out OO in Python, the without OO in Java, and then the with as well too. So there's four combinations. Without OO in both of these, and with OO in both of these. And this takes a huge amount of time. And he actually teaches you're required to do a bit of what I describe as a hack. Java is meant to be OO. That's how it's designed. A bit of a hack so you can kind of do it procedurally. That's his choice as the coordinator. Not all instructors do it. It's not wrong, by the way. There's some advantages doing this, where essentially you're simulating procedural programming with Java. I've done it in the past, but when I've taught 233 and 219 myself, I decided not to because of the advantages and disadvantages. So you're going to spend a lot of time about the first half of that class learning Java syntax and some Java libraries, basically in a procedural fashion. But another reason why there's not as much OO for the reasons you learn other tools. A large focus is learning Java rather than OO. And again, that's his decision prerogative as the course coordinator. Advantages of focusing on Java versus OO, and the two aren't the same. Because as you saw, there's other languages and not just Python and Java that have OO, C++, Smalltalk, and so on. He's focusing on Java, the language, over the programming concepts. And here's some examples of how he's focused on some of the libraries, as it were. Although they don't call them libraries per se in Java, they call them classes, and then the classes are grouped into packages. And here's some of the learning objectives in terms of what you're supposed to get out of the class as well, too. The recursion we didn't talk about. Well, I mentioned a word about recursion, a function or method calling itself. That's something more we'll get into greater detail in this class actual code examples. Earlier concepts. So this is what Hudson has said. So I'm these are my notes, but I've taken some of the things that he wanted to stress. So very quickly, they'll talk about some of the Python concepts taught in 217 very quickly, and they compare it. Here's the equivalent in Java, and here's some of the concepts to get you up and running. And here's something that is actually new here. He said that the notes are identical between 217 and 219, but me being fresh off the version specifically that you have learned, at least last semester if you took it, the command line arguments weren't something that were in the curriculum for 217 last semester because that coordinator, Shell Cheatham, she decided to focus a lot on other things. So that's something new that you'll pick up. It's essentially when you start your program, you can give inputs to your program. And this will be review, but it'll be necessary review because if you feel kind of, okay, implementing classes, do I understand objects? You're a bit on the shaky side, then don't feel bad. You've only had a few weeks of it. When I only had a few weeks of it as a student, I was shaky. How did I actually become more competent, more knowledgeable, more proficient implementing these things? By practice and over time. So we'll go through the basics again to refresh your memory, as well as show you here's how it's done, in my opinion, the proper way, how it's done in Java. And it's not Java specific. C++, in my opinion, actually implements object orientation better than, much better than Python does as well too. Later lecture content after that first part, some of the tools, Git. Git is used for version control. So if you've never used version control, basically you can informally have different versions of your file. I do this outside of programming if I'm writing something more than trivial that's very important. I'll basically just inside the operating system make copies of it in case, say, I make a major change and I'm not sure if I want to keep it. I have the original go back to if I'm writing something like, say, I'm writing on my resume, something very important. That's an example of manual version control. I make my own versions. Git is an automated, sort of automated type control, and it provides many sophisticated features that are harder. It's more complicated, but provides many features that are that you can't easily do if you manually do it yourself. That's what I'd say. Another thing with Git is, besides providing those features, first it's complicated, a little complicated to learn, but there'll be resources to help you through it. They'll teach you in tutorial. I'll do a little bit. I think the idea with Git and lecture is you just get the theory of it, and then you get the hands-on in lecture, if I recall. But also Git is used the majority of time for version control in the real world, so it's a useful tool to learn. It's tough at first, a little bit tedious. This is what I got from students, but it's unnecessary learning. That's what they've said in their comments. Testing, formally testing using the JUnit. Testing, well, we'll talk about that, but that's what JUnit is for, formal testing of different cases. So say if you have a branch, you're testing cases where, I don't know, where if it's a number, the number's less than zero, number's zero exactly, number's greater than zero. That's just very simple testing. Can do more sophisticated with JUnit. More in-depth information about classes and objects. So this is actually good, where now we get into the traditional 233 stuff, the OO part of it, and some new things that you may or not have learned, but also implementation. Another thing is, this isn't mandatory for OO, but having larger software systems, larger projects, is, in some instructors' opinion, they feel that it's necessary to learn these things. I tend to disagree with that. However, it doesn't hurt to have larger ones to prepare you for the real world as well too. When I've taught 233, 219, I found ways apparently of successfully teaching these concepts where you see value of it with smaller projects. There is a way of doing this, but it doesn't hurt to have larger ones as well too. DUML is a graphical notation you'll learn as well too that's standard. developing the GUIs, there were two main approaches. There still are two main approaches in Java. The original one was, well, there was a pre one, the Swing, but the original one called AWT is obsolete. Swing is one that still exists and is still used, but it's an older approach in JavaFX. Doesn't mean that Swing is useless. It's still actually used, but the company behind Java, Sun/Oracle, is trying to phase it out, but it hasn't gotten rid of it entirely. So we'll be using JavaFX. There is some advantages in Swing. It's not mandatory in Hudson's components, but I almost certainly will have it in one of my participation, which is, but also recall it's a bonus as well too. Just to give you a feel, because if you're working with a graphical user interface in the future that is Java based, it's very much possible that you could actually have to encounter Swing, and it's quite a bit different from JavaFX. So having some idea of what it's like would be useful. Beyond that, there are some advantages of Swing that JavaFX doesn't have, where it actually is a very good teaching tool for actually going back and showing an application of inheritance, for instance, and then potentially of interfaces. And this is where personally myself, I found that I didn't necessarily have to have larger software projects to actually have students really see the value of some of these, to learn and see the value of these. But again, it's not right versus wrong. There's different approaches. But this is for different reasons. I'll talk a little bit about Swing as well too. How you'll be evaluated. So this is from the course outline. Had to go through a few times just to make sure. There'll be quizzes, which are essentially, so there's no exams, but they're the exam-like component where you're writing a D2L quiz. He has 6 of them, but it's the best. If I recall, we didn't explicitly talk about it. He verbally said it, but he didn't put it in his written materials. 5, and then he says 5 out of 6, but then there's actually a 7th. That's where I got confused in 233. So there should be essentially it's total 10%, and there's 6 that he produces, and then my 7th grade, it's called a quiz, but that one's going to split up among. So I can pick whatever I want to. I could have a single quiz. My quote quiz 7. Now those D2L quizzes in a real-time class, I used to run them real-time, so I teach a concept and run them. Well, I obviously can't do it this semester, so I'll probably open up for a period of time, and then you can write it as you will. But if he's taking the same as with 233, the best 5, so 2 essentially should be able to be dropped. And one of my quizzes will have Swing, but one of many quizzes, 12, 13, or whatever, just to keep you honest. So it's not a high pressure graded component for most people, at least mine wasn't. And even these ones, because you can drop one of his, reduces the pressure. Let's see. So there's a participation that, if I recall, he's got it on the outline something else, but he said quiz 7 is my component. And then with the project, so that's a group one, half of your term grade. So this is how much it's worth of your term grade, but the reflections is the only part. So the part in blue is the part that I grade, that participation component that's part of the quizzes. And then the reflection, that is 5% of this 50%. It's basically, well, whatever I want to, but it's what you learned. Likely it'll be what you learned from working on the project. What did you get out of it? I have to think about it again, and then you you submit it in some form to D2L. I actually might use a D2L quiz to structure it, because if I have you submit a file, it can be a bit of a mess. But I'll think about it. I'll let you know how I want it for my lecture later in the semester. And then, so these are the group ones bigger. These are the individual ones smaller. 3 assignments. There's an official course outline. Basically, I got this from the outline here. This is where I got confused last semester, but he did explicitly, it says participation here and participation here. So I'd gotten confused between these two, but he explicitly said in our meetings for 217 that this counts as a quiz 7. So you'd have to ask him what this participation, which should be different from this participation. He kind of uses the same term in different parts. But this is the part in blue that I'm supposed to be responsible. This is the part in blue that I'm responsible for. He's going to send notices for these quizzes. So his quizzes, they're D2L quizzes. You can refer to your course notes. They're open during a period of time. Lecture content, you can refer to lecture content. So my lecture notes you can refer to. But again, don't rely on looking things up. The location of Hudson's, if he keeps it the same structure as he did for 233, here's how to find it. Now, it would be a good idea to go through his, at least skim it. Although I was fairly careful, and I actually looked at his and based mine on his, they weren't identical, except for one section. It's a good idea to see how he presents things, so it wouldn't hurt to go through his. So participation, I'll have these, well, I normally have real time. I'll have them non-real time in this case, mostly based on participation. So what I did last semester essentially was, I think I had the best out of, but I'll let you know more details at this point later in the semester. So it won't be exact where you have to, it'll either be the best out of, maybe 10 out of 13, or else it could be if you actually tried to do it, then you get a score. Either way, it's fairly low pressure. The assignment, so this is not what I'm responsible for, but I give you an overview, individual parts. In terms of what you're allowed to do, Hudson actually specifies this, how to submit it. So D2L Dropbox, but also upload it to Git, the UCalgary Git, his due time. I didn't actually double check this. Shoot. Sorry about this. I just realized this now. For updated due dates. Notes may be for winter 2025. They'll be probably around this time, but the official ones are what he actually puts. I mean, it's because the D2L Dropbox is what's going to cut you off. That's what's official. Sorry, you missed that one thing. Okay, so this is what Hudson says about late. You can read through this. You have basically these buffer times, how you can use it. Oops, clear out this stuff. Explanation for how he counts things. If you have questions about these details, he's the one to ask for clarifications, because he's the one who specifies these particular rules, how this actually is set up. I'm putting it here so you have it available. He should put it somewhere, probably in the assignment description, but these are important things. The more times you see it, more likely is that you'll be aware of it. So if you have those buffer days, just like before, no penalty. If you don't, this is a plus and minus I have with buffer days. I'm debating it whether you use it in classes that aren't coordinated. This is what I typically see. You get an automatic 0. This is the part I tend not to like. I don't have buffer days myself, but then I also have, if they don't have a good reason for submitting it approval, then they take a progressive penalty rather than a straight zero. So there's pluses and minuses either way, but this is what he has specified for this class. So Hudson is the person to contact. As far as I know, he's not using the faculty assigned link. Not me, because I don't have anything to do it. Here's his requirements for contacting him, the 5 business days. Again, he has details in each assignment and in the course outline about this, and I have a link to the course outline. The project, okay, so this part might be 233 stuff. Little details. Group size. But the main key point is you are working in a group, whether say it's 3 or greater than 3. Off the top of my head, I think it was actually larger group sizes for this class. Here, for your references, the U Calgary Git, you need to submit it. There's demos. And here's, okay, the projects were 50%. So it's 30 plus 20 here. So there's a 50. So this is the part I grade. The rest is Hudson and or the head TA or TAs as well too. You have to have these demonstrations or demos for short. And I mentioned what he mentioned. You have to do it sometime during the tutorial times. When the TA indicates when the tutorials are running, the demos are running, you have to basically do that demonstration. I think it's you pick a section, but I don't recall because I wasn't involved in that. But you get a 0 if you don't show up. Be aware of that. That's Hudson's requirement. The grades, so this is basically from what Hudson said, paraphrasing of it. Each of the components, you get a letter grade. So for instance, you're supposed to get a letter grade for, when I grade this, something out of the 4.0 letter grade for reflection. And you should get a letter grade for each one of these as well too. So you get some conversion potentially from the quiz, because his quizzes won't necessarily be out of 4 to convert it to a letter grade somehow. But he'll have the cutoff scale from the points to letter grade. He'll make it available in each assessment. So essentially, you just take, to figure out your term grade, you just multiply your grade point by the weight. So suppose that we have assignment 1, you get a grade point of this. Assignment 2, you get a grade point of C minus this. So you have a 3, and just for simplicity, you only have 2 components, 2 assignments, assignment 1 and assignment 2 for the calculations here. If 1 is worth 10%, 2 is worth 10%, you take your letter grade, multiply it by the weight, and this is basically adding to your term GPA. Somewhere along the line, we then have to map, because we're all required to give you a letter grade, not a GPA, map this to a letter grade, A minus, and so on. Hudson does this, the mapping, because he does the term grading. Basically, misconduct. You can read through this essentially. This is the potential penalties. Don't run the gauntlet and violate the rules. He has automated checking, so basic things. You trying to hide that you copied someone else's stuff, they don't work. That's what he's trying to say. There is some information about cheating in the calendar. He says refer to. This course is fundamental for the courses for computer science students. That's why he's so strict about it. There's a project component where you can collaborate, but the other ones you should not collaborate. This part I did add that's new over here. As a reminder, unlike the previous ones, you should not employ external tools such as, but not limited to, AI for basically generating what you're going to submit for grading. I say not limited to AI. Say if you get a tutor, you should not be asking your tutor about graded components like assignments and projects, because the danger is they basically do it for you in varying degrees. So you should not rely on external tools, but I stress the AI, because coming out being a 217 instructor, I saw how much there was a focus on it. I'm mentioning this extra little thing to protect you here, because I don't want anyone, my people or the other sections, as people getting into trouble. So basically, it has to be your work. If you get it from an external source, he says cite it. You don't necessarily, unless he specifies a format, you don't have to have a format. But the key part is you clearly delineate what is yours versus what is the external sources. And you need to know it for the quizzes, because quizzes, if you don't know, uh, if all the code that you generate for the assignments comes from, say, AI or your tutor, well, then you're going to have a problem in the exam-like component, the quizzes. That's what he's getting at. With the projects, you have to complete individual parts yourself. Partners complete their parts. For assignments, okay. So for part of the project, the reflection, as well as for these things, they're all individual work, and you can't do any group work. Procedural versus object-oriented. You had a little bit of that. You'll get more delineation. Procedure, decompose your program procedures, which is another name in most cases for functions. In some ways, procedurally, think of it as step by step, essentially. Even branching and looping, repetition, is still steps. You're repeating steps. That's why branching and looping, even though 217 doesn't describe it necessarily formally as procedural, it says things like branching and looping, and that's part of procedural. Now, these things are necessary and object-oriented, but you have more. You're decomposing your program into the entities, which are classes, class definitions. You were taught this in theory in 217, but you really didn't have to do an implementation. In this class, you'll be doing implementation. You have a class definition, which is like a blueprint, essentially. And then you actually have, it's a new type of variable. And then from that new type of variable, you actually create actual example variables from that type. Again, this is where you might be shaky. Some of understanding what we've talked about in 217. That's where you'll go from the purely shaky potentially to less shaky at the very least. But myself, I didn't actually really start getting good at OO, or at least okay, until I started forcing myself to apply it properly in higher level classes, 400 or 500 level classes when I was a TA. You'll get less shaky at the very least in this class. That's the goal. Both. You're decomposing, see, decompose, but it's how you decompose. That's a difference. You're decomposing into parts, and the idea is you're reducing complexity by only focusing on a part at a time. Good programming style, unlike what you previously saw, Hudson will enforce it in terms of grading, which is a good thing. So it forces you to actually follow good programming style, or you'll suffer some sort of penalty. Well, you'll see that in the assignment description. Decomposition is a good thing if you didn't learn it, besides reducing complexity. You only work on that part of the program at a time, but it also makes it easier to test. And this is something that you'll extensively have to do for this class, testing.